That's why I don't like the wholesale ridiculing of all religion that some people, I think, a bit too glibly do.
So, would you detect some daylight between yourself and me and some of my colleagues? I mean, for a very long time, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, and
Mm,
I were being described essentially as a four-headed atheist. We're the new atheists.
mm.
And there are differences between certainly
Yes,
differences of emphasis, but also just differences of what we believe to be true or important there. But the generic picture of a very strident attack on all religion,
yes,
in principle, because it's so much of it, really all of it that's relevant to us, rests on a claim about the divine origin of specific books,
right.
which is on its face ridiculous and
Hmm.
disproved by the contents of every page of those books. It sounds like you aren't fully aligned with that project.
No, I'm not.
Talk about that.
I'm not for various reasons, but I mean, one is, and I don't apply this by any means to you or to Christopher.
Hmm.
I have a problem with something that, as it were, some of your admirers have ended up doing, which is to say the problem is all religion. And you see, and I find this a weaselly way out. I think this is one of the ways in which people avoid the problem. Uh, look, I can
Oh,
understand why people think it,
so just to
but
be clear, that the problem is all religion as opposed to the problem of
we've got a
Islam in this
real
moment.
problem.
Oh, yes.
Exactly.
Well, yes. Well, if I haven't
And
been
clear on
energetic
that.
enough on
And
spelling out
and
why
I'm
that's confusion, I have to
yeah.
get less sleep at night. But
And and Christopher also
yeah.
was very clear about that. I have a residual. I am sure you won't mind me saying this. A little problem with Richard Dawkins uh, that has an amusing background. If you don't mind
Oh,
me
please.
relaying it for a few minutes. Richard and I were meant to be doing a debate a few years ago at the Cambridge Union, where I think the plan was that it was him and me beating up a couple of imams, which sounded great to me. I was looking
Yeah.
forward to it enormously. Of course, as you know, actually, Muslim religious leaders never actually turn out for debate. I mean, I don't know if you've ever debated. Well, I mean, they
Mm-mm.
just don't debate.
Mm.
Various sort of scholars and pseudo scholars and publicity seekers do, but generally the imams steer clear of it for the very clear reason, which is that they know that they'll look like idiots, and what they believe or pretend to believe will be disproved. I mean, they're right to avoid the debate on their own terms.
Mm.
But anyhow, I was looking forward to this. It turned out that we didn't have any imams, but we did have Rowan Williams, sheepish
Mm-hmm.
former Archbishop of Canterbury, and Tariq Ramadan, as I mentioned before, a very dear enemy. But unfortunately, I think it was Richard's fault that the motion became stronger and stronger and harder, as it were. And it became that there's no place for religions in the 21st century.
Mm.
And I thought that was a preposterous thing. And so I switched sides and won the debate for the other side, despite the fact I
uh,
couldn't talk to either of my
right.
people on the other side because I'd been so rude about the Archbishop and so vitriolic about Tariq Ramadan that I think we agreed that I would speak last. He said he wouldn't have that, Tariq, because he said you will spend the whole time attacking me, and I gave him my word I wouldn't.
Uh-huh.
I only spent half the speech attacking him. But I tell you this because there's another segue of this, which is that I've also been a bit rude about Richard in that I think now he has changed on this, but certainly some years ago he used to give Islam a bit of a soft ride in compared to Christianity.
Mm.
And there's a famous interview which he did on Al Jazeera with somebody called Mehdi Hassan, where Mehdi Hassan read the opening of chapter 2 of The God Delusion, an amazing piece of rhetoric about how God is the God of the Old Testament
Yeah.
is the most vile, appalling, disgraceful, disgusting figure in all of fiction. So this was read to him on Al Jazeera. And the interviewer said to Richard Dawkins, you believe that of the God of the Old Testament? He said, yes, I do, quite rightly. The interviewer said, and you believe that of the God of the Christians? And Richard said, I do, quite rightly. And then the interviewer said, and what about the God of the Quran? And this little flicker went across Richard's eyes, and he said, the God of the Quran, I know less about. And I wrote a piece after this saying that this wasn't surprising, and a surprising response from Richard Dawkins. Professor Dawkins was simply demonstrating the survival instinct of his species. I, I, I was so pleased with this
Uh,
gag. I reported it. I retold it everywhere I went, and Ri- Ri- Richard quite rightly took exception to this and said when I next saw him that I owed him an apology, and I gave him a sort of half-assed apology, but because he has actually and did actually later in that interview, to be fair to him, ridicule the idea that Prophet Mo flew around on a half-human horse and all this kind of crap, and so he did go into it a bit more. But I knew exactly what was going on in that moment, and that Richard Dawkins effectively came up against that cliff, which we all know is there, which is when what is true and what needs to be said is right at the point where it could screw everything in your life up. Not because it isn't true, but because you're on Al Jazeera and the entire Muslim world could be watching, and you may very well discover you've got to leave your house, you've got to go away for a bit, you've got to go into hiding, and worse. So it's a bit cruel that I ridicule him and give him as an example, is because actually I think Richard Dawkins has done amazing work in all sorts of ways in his career. But I understand the slight reticence, and it's a bit cruel of me to pick up on it when it has occurred. And I don't think it occurs so much now. But no, my main beef is with the people, the sort of Twitter warriors who responded after Paris the other day by saying, the problem is all religions. And I think that's a cop-out. Because I think you need to say, actually, you know what? The response to a load of jihadist Islamists going around Paris, gunning people down for being in a restaurant, does not mean you've got to close like Anglican schools in England that do a perfectly good job of educating kids. It does not mean you need to crack down on rabbis, in synagogues across Europe. In a way, this points to a a cowardice underneath a cowardice in our time, which is that I think that it is you and Christopher and others made it possible to say all religions are untrue, all religions can be terrible. All of this is true, but the thing is, in a way, you've also given people the ability to say, we've got a problem with one religion at the moment. But I would say that there is one thing beyond that, which it's also important to consider that some of us still think, which is actually some religions are better than others.
Yes. Yeah.
Anglican Christianity, by and large, is a lot better than Sunni Islam. I mean, you'd much rather have the local Anglican vicar come round to tea than your average fire-breathing imam. And we're very lucky, that is the case. And I sort of just think it needs nodding to.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm actually perpetually nodding on that point. And since the beginning, I have always been very clear to spell out that generic atheism doesn't make any sense. I mean, there is this bias, a very strong bias among self-identified atheists, that if you're going to be an intellectually consistent atheist, you have to oppose all religions equally, because they're all equally invalid. But this is just simply untrue. It's untrue as a matter of fact, and it's untrue as a matter of moral imperative. So all religions are not equally improbable, because any specific doctrine can be more or less at odds with what we know to be true about the nature of the universe. And if you keep adding doctrines to one another, your belief system becomes less and less plausible. So it's a very simple point I've made, and to the confusion of many people, but Mormonism is objectively less likely to be true than generic Christianity is, because this is a simple statement of mathematical probability. The Mormons believe basically everything Christians believe, and they believe some additional nonsense. So whatever probability you put at Jesus' return to earth to resurrect the dead, you have to put a lesser probability on the claim that he will return to the precise spot of Jackson County, Missouri, right? As opposed to returning anywhere. So the Mormons lose that probabilistic contest there.
Yeah.
And
wouldn't it be brilliant if there were actually documentation saying that Muhammad had a conviction for fraud before pretending to hear the Quran? I'm sure he did. I'm sure he did. We just don't have the paperwork.
It's too bad we don't know as much about Muhammad as we do of Joseph Smith, no doubt. And this, obviously, for just across the board, this is relevant. So when I say that specific beliefs matter, that means that when I criticize the religious impediments to embryonic stem cell research, I'm not talking about Islam, because Islam doesn't take a
Mm.
position there. Islam has a admittedly crazy idea, but nonetheless useful idea, that the soul doesn't enter the fetus until far past the moment of conception, either day 80 or day 120, depending on which
Mm.
hadith you believe. And so the Islamic State could practice embryonic stem cell research, right? So
Mm.
Islam is not a problem on that front. On that front, we're talking about Christianity and Judaism for the most part. But on every other front, now relevant to the maintenance of civilization, Islam, political Islam, jihadism is the problem we all have to focus
Mm.
on. And
Yeah.
and my concern, which I've voiced now, no doubt to the boredom of our listeners, they've heard me say it many times over, but perhaps you haven't heard it. My concern is that because of what has happened to the left, and because of the narcissism of the small difference that just captivates
Mm.
everyone in polite society now, where, as Mark Stein said, we're going to be talking about the truly trivial when nukes go off in some major American or European cities. My concern is that at a certain point we will see only the far right in our own society become
Mm.
energized enough to call a spade and
Right.
address the problem of creeping theocracy under the guise of
Mm.
the civil rights of Muslims.
Could I
Yeah,
give another example of why that is? This gets into another point. As I say, it might be a point of difference between us before I get to a point
sure.
of similarity. I mean, I am very concerned, and this, I think, again, this is a matter of, it's a transatlantic difference. But because Christianity in my country is not at the stage that it is in yours,
Hmm.
we have fewer of these interventions that hamper the public debate and indeed public science and various things like that than you do. It would be highly unusual now for a Christian religious belief to significantly change any debate in the UK. But there is something which, I mean, the left-wing German philosopher Jürgen Habermas wrote an essay
Hmm.
some years ago that I've often thought about and occasionally cited. It's called An Awareness of What's Missing.
Hmm.
Well,
Yeah,
to
I'm
my
familiar.
mind, it's one of the most important contributions to European philosophy in recent years. It's very short, but I think this thing it describes, for your listeners who don't know this, a funeral of a colleague of his in Germany, which is in a cathedral, a large church, and the coffin is there, and various things are read from and said, but it's not a religious service, and there is no amen.
Hmm.
And Habermas reflects on this and the statement he believes his friend was making, which is that there is something missing in the modern European, let's say, West, which is a profound question mark that remains. And I think this goes to, I'll get onto the Islam thing in a second, but I think
Hmm.
this goes to a very, very fundamental issue, which the Islam thing is therefore simply feeding on in a way, or its success is feeding on.
Hmm.
Another continental philosopher, sorry to be so specific, but a wonderful French philosopher called Chantal Del Sol wrote a book in the 90s called Icarus Fallen, where she described modern European Western man as being in the state that Icarus would have been in had he survived the fall.
Hmm.
And what she meant was, we've tried in Europe, and Europe being, as it were, in political terms, a much older continent than America. I hope you don't mind me saying so, but has been through so many things and tried so many things and had so many disasters. We've tried religion, we've tried different types of religion, we've tried different types of politics. We tried fascism and communism and socialism and all sorts of other things. And at the end of the last experiment, which was obviously communism, after it collapsed in 1990 in Europe, at the end of that, European man found himself lying on the floor with his wings singed, and yet he's still here.
Mm.
So what does he do?
Mm.
All of the dreams have been shown to be failures, but yet we're alive. And I think this is one of the most troubling questions, and I put it out there as a question, because you see, what is happening at the moment with the Islamists is, yes, they have their own propulsion, and yes, they have their own message and their own campaign and their own aims, but they cannot possibly succeed unless a society like European society is so deracinated, so bereft of things to want to survive and fight for, that it only will retain its comforts, only will fight for its remaining comforts, but ultimately is not able to defend itself. Now, that is the problem. Let me give you one quick, this is a bit fatuous as an example. Let me give you a quick example. The day after the massacre in Paris on Friday at the Bataclan Theatre, outside the theatre, where almost 100 people were gunned down at a concert, where the jihadists, the Islamists, lined up disabled people in their wheelchairs and shot them one by one, shot people in their teens, shot people who were grandparents, shot people in the back and in the head. The most grotesque massacre in modern times in Europe. The next day, this man turned up, who always turns up after terrorist incidents, and he brings a keyboard and he plays John Lennon's Imagine. And all of these broadcasters and newspapers and things were quite taken by this again. People said how moving it was. And I think, screw that. This is no time to turn up with your ruddy keyboard and sing John Lennon. Imagine there's no countries. Yeah, okay, you don't need to imagine. They've been trying it on the continent. The Schengen Agreement erodes borders. John Lennon would have loved it. Well, so do the jihadists. Guess what? Free movement of people, free movement into the continent, free movement from North Africa and the Middle East into Europe, and then once you're in Europe, free movement wherever you like. They love that. We don't need this ruddy utopian Leninism any more than we needed any other stupid ideology. But this weak, pitiful, let's change our hashtag, let's do a hashtag, let's turn our Facebook profile to the tricolor. It's well-meaning, but seriously, that's not enough. Being sad isn't enough. Being sad will stop no massacres. Being sad will not divert one.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.